Hello, my name's Mike Sherwood Smith. This is the fifth in the series Modelling the Mind, a series of YouTube presentations based on the modular cognition framework. The idea is to get you acquainted with your mind and know roughly how it works. I'm going to do my best to keep things simple. Remember, as always, I remind people I'm not talking about the brain, I'm talking about the mind. So don't imagine the mind is full of boxes and circles. It is not, any more than the London Underground is represented faithfully by the iconic map of the London Underground that you see in every tube station. So here we are with the mind again, the environment outside and inside the mind looking rather peaceful, nice blue there. Unfortunately, I've got news for you, and that is that inside it's the law of the jungle, and this is what I'm going to be talking about. Yes, indeed. Luckily, of course, I mean the good news is that we're only consciously aware of a tiny fraction of what goes on in our mind. Most of the activity, the vast amount of the activity that goes on, we are completely unaware of, and if it's anything like that, you'll be glad to know that you will never be aware of it. Life is sometimes unsettling enough without being aware of all the awful raging jungle things that are going on in there. So I will get rid of that jungle picture and restore some semblance of peace and tranquility and order. And as you will know, if you've been following the previous presentations, and I hope you have, if you haven't, I would suggest you go back and look at them first. We have here the mind again, but inside we have the knowledge systems, the different knowledge systems. Here outside, in a sort of outside ring, is what I call the perceptual portal, and these are the ones that engage directly with the outside world. The outside world, of course, is just a lot of physical sensations impinging on each of our five senses. The auditory system through the ears, of course, the olfactory system through the nose, the gustatory system through the tongue, the visual system through the eyes, and this rather complicated sort of cluster of senses which are combined to a single sense these days, called the somatosensory system, which is basically the sense we have of our body, including touch, but also of an ownership of the body. So that gives us our outer ring. But those pieces of visual, taste knowledge, somatosensory knowledge, those pieces of knowledge have no meaning for us, and they have no value, and that's why we had to add the meaning system, the conceptual system, which allows us to associate bits of auditory knowledge with meaning knowledge, conceptual knowledge, and we also needed the affective system, the affective system, to associate various values, and basic emotions come along with that, but values, at least positive or negative, with each of these sensations, so we can have a visual sensation, a little visual piece of knowledge, a representation which can be tied up with something pleasant, something positive, or something negative. In the same way, we can have a piece of taste knowledge, gustatory knowledge, linked up with something bad. So there we have a basic model of the mind. We have left out two important systems, but I will get to those next time. Okay, so remember, now we don't have to go into the hardware details of the brain. We can simplify things a great deal. We can talk basically of these various knowledge systems, these expert systems that have a special role to play and can collaborate one with the other, which contain a processor, which is the bit that handles all knowledge systems, the knowledge representations, which are sitting here in the store, and each of these knowledge systems are coded in a particular way. That means they cannot be merged together in one big sort of global blob of information because they are mutually incompatible. But what can happen, as I hope made clear last time, is that they can be activated together in parallel. So if you have a piece of knowledge in this system, a representation which has been associated with another representation in the knowledge system, they can be activated together. And we began with the idea that they can be associated. Of course, you have to have an interface connection with a system in order to be able to associate the representations in it. And here we have a sound which can be associated with a visual image, and it's linked together with an interface. And this visual interface is equally associated with a taste sensation. So we have, as it were, what looks like a chain of associations. In actual fact, almost all associational networks will be networks and not chains, right? So, for example, the sound will be directly associated with a taste as well. So, knowledge of an apple will at least include knowledge of its taste in most people who've had the experience of a taste. It will certainly contain representations of what apples look like, and it will probably most likely it will be an association with a sound, maybe a crunch, or other sounds like apples dropping on grass. All of these could be many different representations, many different sounds, many different visual images, representations, many different tastes perhaps, and all of this plus more, of course, in the total network associated with Apple in general, will give you a global sense of what apples are for an individual at least, and that is then association. But there's more to it, because once representations are associated one with the other, and you might ask, how does that work? Well, the general idea is that there's a little code, a little tag, or little index, which let's call it, I know, XYZ. So a particular sound, if it's associated with a visual image, gets the same identifying index, so XYZ. So of course each representation may have hundreds and thousands of these indexes, but in this case you have XYZ, which links it with XYZ here and XYZ here. They have little things so that whenever one is activated, the other ones are as well. And that leads me indeed to activation. Activation is when a particular representation in the mind is brought to life, as it were, is activated. More of that in a minute. But once it is activated, then anything that happens to be associated with it will also be activated. I mentioned this in an earlier presentation. So you may, of course, be focusing on an apple, for example, and the visual image may be activated more intensely than anything else, but these other associated representations will automatically be activated to some extent as well. And so networks are constantly being activated in our mind. And now let's think about representations. Here is a store, a particular knowledge store, where particular kinds of representations are housed, and these representations, as you see, they have their own links together within the system. Now they're all coded together, they're all written in the same code, the same language, so in a sense they can be join together and be regarded, at least when they're activated, as a kind of a complex of knowledge, complex blob of knowledge. But we're not really going to go into these associations. It's the same principle as what happens outside between different knowledge systems, but we're going to leave that aside. The only thing I wanted to say is that I'll be treating representation singly, just for the sake of simplification, but in actual fact most representations are very complex. They are clusters like this, and they can be activated together, but we're going to forget that and treat each one as separate. So if you see a circle from now on, it could be a simple one, or it could be a complex of associations inside a particular knowledge system. Okay, so representations can be at in a resting state. They can be dormant, right? And if you're interested in the brain and know something about it, this may immediately suggest a state that cells can be in, a resting state that cells can be in, which is also true. The fact is that a representation isn't equivalent to a cell in the brain. Usually there are many cells which are connected together, which a representation would be. We can talk in simple terms of a simple circle, simple representations. But yes, cells do have resting potentials, and they can be fired, which I would say in our terms is activated. Okay, so these resting, you may notice that there are different levels here, so I better talk about that. So indeed, every cell, sorry, my mistake, see, easy to do. We're talking about the mind, aren't we, not the brain. So every representation here, as you see, is at a particular level. And these levels are called the resting levels of activation. So whenever it's resting, it's at a particular level. And it's very convenient if we can use the metaphor, and it is just a metaphor, the metaphor of height. So imagine they're in a tank, as it were, and they're floating happily at a particular level of a resting level of activation. So whenever they're dormant, they're at this. In actual fact, just like cells, representations may always have some sort of background activity, because the brain is constantly buzzing, and there's a lot of noise going on, and activation is a relative matter. But it's convenient for us to talk about dormant and active representations. And here they are at their various resting levels. Now, the thing is, again, talking about them in a sort of using this metaphor of height, the higher a resting level of activation is of a representation, the more competitive it is, because there is competition going on, and it's good from the point of view of representation, if I can think of them that way, that they rest fairly high up, because it means that they have a fighting chance if they have to compete against other representations which may be also active at the same time. And this gives you a beginning of the flavour of what I was talking about earlier, that it is a jungle in there. So when a structure, a representation, by the way, we usually talk about these as structures. That's what a representation basically is, but I will continue to call it a representation. When representations are activated, that is when they are currently in working memory. So working memory is activated representations, and in each knowledge system, representations may be in the working memory of that knowledge system. So it's all happened in the same store. There they are, located in their particular store, and they are either in a state of rest or they are activated. When they're activated, it's another way of saying they're in working memory. Now, each time a representation is activated, its resting level of activation gets boosted. So it's very good for a representation to be activated, and the more the better, because every time it gets a boost. So as we see, this one used to be at the lower level, the dotted line, then it was activated and it returns to a location somewhat higher. And remember, higher is better than lower. In general, when a new representation is formed, it begins at a low down, right? So it's relatively inaccessible. It can't be accessed, is one way of looking at it, so quickly. So it doesn't have a very good chance in competition. But the more it is used, the more it gets activated, the more its resting level is boosted. So it never returns, when it has been activated, it never returns to a resting level that is precisely the same as the one it had before. This is the way, the metaphor of height, levels of height, we can express this idea of what happens when things are activated, when representations are activated. Okay, now I've been trying to think of a simple example. Being a linguist, of course, words come to mind best, but I wanted to take something which is not to do with language, to give you an idea of how competition works. So imagine you had an old phone, there it is, the orange phone, and it has a particular ring tone when it rings to alert you, or when there's a call coming in. It has a particular ringtone that you're very familiar with, and you're very familiar with the look of the old phone. You've been using it for a long time. Now you've bought yourself a new one, which is quite like the old one, but it's a different colour. There's a slightly different appearance about it, and it has a slightly different noise. It makes a slightly different noise when a call comes in. So the tone of the call tone will be different, the ring tone. Right, so the question is, what is going on in the mind when this happens? Thing is, what have you got? Well, now you've currently got your old phone ring sound in the auditory system, in the auditory store, and it's fairly high up. It's got a high resting level, and you've got a new one that's just arrived, but it's rather low down, right? Because it's new, it hasn't had much activation. Its resting level by default is pretty low. In the same way, you've got a visual representation. You're getting used to the new one, which is down here, but of course the one you're more familiar with will be higher up. Its resting level will be higher up, easily accessed when it's activated. And you've also, in your conceptual store, which is where meaning representations are located, you've got the notion of a phone, you've got the meaning of a phone, and well, I did say I wasn't going to talk about complex representations. Well, here is just one. You've got the notion of my self, if you like, and so you can link in your conceptual system the meaning of phone with the notion of ownership, mine. I myself own a phone, and this of course will be most strongly associated with the old phone representations in other knowledge systems. So let's say the new phone sounds, and if we progress through an imagined sequence of events, fractions of a second, one after the other, the first thing you hear is a phone. So there will be the phone will be activated, the phone meaning, and this will be linked with your old phone, certainly, and it will be linked with the old phone sound, as well as the old phone appearance. And this will be a strong activation, be immediately activated. Okay, immediately activated. What happens then in the next fraction of a second? We might imagine, again, something like this. You realise suddenly that it's not your phone. Right? We won't go into how you do that, but you do. You realise it's not your phone. It's a different phone sound. So somehow the old phone notion, the old visual representation, these ones suddenly get deactivated, and they start to descend, which gives a better fighting chance for the new one. So these these ones will then be activated very strongly now, and this will help them to be recognised more efficiently at a later date. But the idea here is that you have had competition, and the competition has taken place in each of these two areas. Each of these two different types of knowledge systems have experienced competition, and here it was the competition between the familiar old phone ring and the new phone ring, which you're just beginning to get used to. And here it was the competition between the visual image of the sight of your old phone and the visual representation of your new phone. And this, of course, all linked up with the meaning of phone and the ownership idea. So, very roughly, it gives you an idea of what I mean by competition. Now, moving from competition to the notion of change, right? So, as we go through life, we're constantly changing, and our mind is constantly changing. New things are coming in, new associations are being formed, other ones are weakening. And change can be regarded as growth. That's one way of looking at it. So new associations are formed over an individual's lifetime, and these new associations can be the direct result of some new experience with the outside world, making us make new associations in our mind, and maybe creating a new representation or changing a network of representations as a result of immediate experience with the outside world. So, our friend Tony, we suddenly see has stolen something, or is in the process of stealing something, or we read that they have stolen something, and as a result of that we make a new association. Tony, who wasn't a thief a moment ago, is now a thief. So we've made an association there, and our knowledge has changed. But new connections could be made, of course, by some internal change, just things occurring to us, something going on inside, without actually anything triggering it outside straight away. For example, we may be thinking about Tony, and we may come to the conclusion that Tony is innocent because we have related Tony, the notion of Tony, to various other things, indicating his extraordinary honesty. And this hasn't been directly, at least, the result of encountering something in the outside world. So growth can happen in those two ways. But sometimes change can be regarded as loss, and I put loss in inverted commas because I want to make a particular comment about the notion of losing things. But indeed, old associations which haven't been activated do generally start to lose their accessibility and their competitiveness because their resting levels decline. So resting levels aren't fixed at all. They can rise because representations are activated, and the more strongly they're activated and the more frequently they're activated, the faster their resting levels can rise and they can become much more accessible. That's a metaphor. But by the same token, if you don't use it, you lose it. Their resting levels will decline and they will fall into disuse. But it is possible never to forget anything. I just want to end with a ray of hope. As you see, here is a representation which has supposedly been disused, is out of use for so long, it's simply been literally lost. We no longer have it, right? But it's possible that, in fact, things simply go down to a level beyond which they stop, sort of ground zero, as it were. But some things can change to alter their accessibility or loss of accessibility. Maybe old age releases them, does something to our minds so that they become more accessible. That's an interesting area of research. Or they simply stay there, and if suddenly something causes them to be activated, they will rise again. In language, for example, there's a study of Dutch women who had never used Dutch for years. As far as they were concerned, they couldn't produce Dutch, they couldn't understand Dutch, but in old age it suddenly started coming back. So these stories suggest that maybe to some extent things can remain with us even though we cannot access them. And with that rather positive note, I would like to end this particular presentation, and next time I'll be getting along to a subject which has always fascinated me, and that is language. But I won't be talking much about linguistics itself, but I will try to explain to you why language is not only one thing which makes us human and is different from other species, despite the fact that other species have ways of communicating with each other which we choose to call language in a loose way. Nevertheless, I would like to explain why in fact this is what makes us human. But even more interesting and more important in the context of our model of the mind, language, using language, engages every knowledge system in the mind, everyone. So it's one of these things which unites everything, and I hope to be able to explain that to you clearly enough next time. So please join me next time for the next presentation on languages in the mind.